almost there. We're almost there. If we start early and somebody gets here and they miss the first words, you know it's going to be terrible. So, okay, we're tickled today to have Dr. Judd Lake from Southern Adventist University, a place which shall not be named, but a place that both of my daughters have gone to school and love very much. He has a lot of expertise. He's written several books. He's in the process of writing more. He is an absolute scholar. He's also a homiletician, whatever that means. And we had a wonderful visit yesterday about Bible study and preaching and all kinds of fun things. So we're excited. He is a serious expert on the subject.
Thank you,
Good to have you,
Pastor James. Pleasure to be here. Ellen White, ever heard of her? What was she like? We often talk about Ellen White and her theology, her educational philosophy, her health teaching, her leadership in the development of the church, but what was she like as a person? The human interest story of Ellen White. There are a lot of false ideas about Ellen White. There are some in the church who hold her up so high that they believe she walked 3 feet off the ground. As some have said in the past, she's like a vegetarian Virgin Mary. That's an extreme view. And then there are others who put her down too much and believe that she really wasn't inspired. She had some good things to say. And then, of course, you have her critics who just want to completely destroy her. This afternoon, I would like to pose the question, will the real Ellen G. White please stand? That's our focus. What was she like? Well, here is a negative caricature of Ellen. This is on the web, one of the negative places on the internet. But it does capture, as I said a moment ago, how some view Ellen White. And this is a very negative caricature as well. The picture of Ellen White, or her face of Ellen White posed on the figure of the Pope. And some have said Adventists refer to Ellen White as their Pope. And that, of course, is an extreme view, but some circles you might find it not too far from that. And then, of course, you have those who are very much against her, have written against her. I deal a lot with the issues of Ellen White's critics, and almost universally, her most outspoken critics are those who were one-time Seventh-day Adventist. Their experience with Ellen White and Adventism was not a positive one. They've taken that experience out of the church and now turned against it. Books like using Ellen White's name, The White Lie, The Whitewashed, White Out. That, of course, is an entirely different presentation dealing with all of that material. I've written about it and presented it on numerous occasions. That, of course, is not our focus, but that is a false Ellen White that many believe. Unfortunately, this view of Ellen White is all too popular and well-known in Seventh-day Adventist circles. Sister White says. Now, Sister White says is not a bad thing. Sometimes when you say Sister White says, that's a good thing. It all depends on how you use her. But some use it as an iron rod to bang people over the head. Sister White says you shouldn't do this, and Sister White says this, and you are not doing this, and Sister White says that has caused untold heartache and pain in Seventh-day Adventist history. Something Ellen White herself struggled with and counseled against. the negative use of a Sister White says. Interestingly, she's a forgotten figure of history. There's been a lot of interest recently in American religious history and a focus on figures in American history that have made a contribution to the religious development, the spiritual development of America. In fact, the subject I spoke on yesterday and I've written on, the American Civil War, it was pretty much a religious war. And Ellen White had some profound things to say about it, as did others at the time. But just recently, historians outside of the Adventist community are recognizing that Ellen White was a significant figure in terms of her religious contribution, not only to the Adventist people, but to other areas as well. She contributed to the temperance movement in the 19th century and a number of other areas. And so she has been a forgotten figure of American history, but is now, like other figures, coming into more, coming to the attention of historians. But will the real Ellen White please stand? For us as Seventh-day Adventists, what was she like as a person? She was a visionary, church leader, public speaker, prolific author. She was a daughter, but she was also a daughter, sister, wife, mother, grandmother, friend. That's the personal side of Ellen White. That's the Ellen White we want to look at. Not so much the visionary or the church leader, but the daughter, sister, wife, mother, grandmother, friend. The person. She had some extraordinary experiences. She said, I am taken into the presence of Jesus and angels and am entirely lost to earthly things. That was a part of her visionary experience. Her first inaugural vision was in December of 1844 after the disappointment when she saw the people of God walking on the long and narrow path. That was the inaugurating vision that began 70 years of prophetic ministry where she had over 1,000 visions. But the personal side of Ellen White, we tend to forget that. Let's start with her family background. Her parents were of British ancestry, sturdy New England stock. Her father, Robert F. Harmon, was a farmer first in Gorham, Maine, where Ellen was born. Then he moved the family to Portland, Maine. There he got into the hat-making business, and that did the family quite well financially. In the tours that I lead, I take my students on up in New England every several years at Southern, and we visit these places. We visit Gorham, we visit Portland, we see these places where Ellen White grew up, and it's most interesting. If you ever have a chance to go to New England and visit these sites, it's well worth it. Her mother was Eunice Gould Harmon. That's where we get the G in Ellen G. White, Ellen Gould Harmon, from her mother. Her mother was a housewife, homemaker. Didn't really have a career as we would think of today, although in the 19th century, being a mother and a housemaker, that was a career for women. She made a profound contribution to Ellen's spiritual experience. As young Ellen struggled spiritually, it was her mother who counseled her and guided her and helped her significantly in her spiritual growth. The family were members, when they moved to Portland, they were members of the Portland, Maine Chestnut St. Methodist Church. Robert was a deacon there. Now they embraced the Millerite message. The family heard William Miller preached. Young Ellen was especially influenced by William Miller, and the whole family embraced the Millerite message. The problem was, by the time you get to 1843, the Millerite message became very controversial. And preachers who had liked William Miller and his followers in earlier years now became very concerned about Miller's setting of a time for Jesus' coming. Most of the clergy of the day believed that Jesus was coming after the millennium. But William Miller taught he's coming before the millennium. He's coming immediately. He's coming soon. He's coming sometime in 1843. And that became too controversial, so they began to disfellowship the Millerites. And from records, we have found that the first family to be disfellowshipped from the Maine Chestnut St. Methodist Church was the Harmon family. So the whole family was ousted from the fellowship. The children had made friends. That was a very difficult experience for all of them. Ellen White had 5 sisters, including a twin, and 2 brothers. Let's go through each one of her siblings and discuss them briefly. Caroline Harmon Clough was her older sister. She married the wife of a Methodist clergyman. In the early days after Ellen White's first vision, her sisters would travel with her as she shared her visions. And they were supportive of that. But as the years went on, they did not embrace the unique truths as the Adventist Sabbatarians, they would later be called, as they developed those truths, and then they established the Seventh-day Adventist Church. A number of her siblings did not embrace that. Caroline never embraced it. Here's a picture of Ellen at age 44 and Caroline age 60. The sisters stayed close throughout their lives. Ellen outlived Caroline. Caroline, of course, was in the Methodist faith. In one letter, Ellen White wrote to Caroline and said, your gift is singing. Caroline was a good singer. And she says, that's not my gift. My gift is speaking. And Ellen White was kind of like me. When it comes to singing, I make a noise intended to be joyful. Caroline could really sing, but Ellen was kind of like me. She made a noise intended to be joyful, perhaps. But her gift was speaking. Ellen White was a very gifted speaker. She could hold audiences up to 10 to 20,000 captive on the edge of their seats. So that truly was her gift. Caroline never embraced the Seventh-day Adventist faith. But Ellen White embraced Caroline's Christianity. She did not condemn her. She accepted her basic Christian faith, although she was concerned that Caroline never embraced the Sabbath. Caroline once told Ellen that when Ellen was talking to her about the Sabbath, Caroline said, well, I'll take my chances. That is, take my chances with the Lord, that He won't condemn me for not keeping the Sabbath. And that concerned Ellen. She wrote about that to family and actually to Caroline's daughter. She really wanted her to embrace the truth, as she called it. But it is interesting that she still accepted their basic Christian faith. I find a great example from Ellen White in how to relate to other Christians. Later in the century, she embraced the women's Christian temperance movement. She never condemned other Christians who differed from her faith. Sometimes we tend to, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist and you're out there. That's not a good idea. I think it should be, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist believer and you're a Baptist believer, friend. Let's talk about Jesus. See, that was Ellen White's attitude. I think we can learn a lot from Ellen White on how to relate to other Christians and embrace their Christianity and engage with them on areas that we agree. We don't have to be argumentative and debate. Back at my home in the Chattanooga area, Collegedale, on the way from Collegedale to Tennessee years ago, there was a sign, big sign that some little misguided Adventist church put up. It said, Sunday is the mark of the beast. And people driving on the interstate saw that sign, and you and I have no idea how many Christians that turned off and turned away from Seventh-day Adventist. That's not a way to witness, to be combative and confrontive. That was never Ellen White's approach. We can be diplomatic and kind in our relationship with other Christians, and I think Ellen White gives us a great example in that, how she related to her own family. Another sister, Harriet Harmon, married a clergyman with the name of McCann. So her sisters still embraced the Christian faith. They married ministers of other denominations. John B. Harmon was a businessman in Illinois. And Mary Plummer Harmon Foss. This is one of Ellen's sisters who became a Seventh-day Adventist, accepted Seventh-day Adventist beliefs, although she never became a baptized member. she married the brother of Hazen Foss. Very interesting story behind Hazen Foss. He had the prophetic gift before Ellen White. I won't tell his entire story, but it is an interesting one. But she married into that family. Sarah Harmon married in the Belden family. Sarah did become a Seventh-day Adventist, and her husband was involved in the publishing work at the Review and Herald. And Robert F. Harmon, this is the only brother of Ellen to become a Seventh-day Adventist. He died of consumption at age 27. Ellen was very close to her brother, and when he died, it was a very difficult experience for her. So as you walk through Ellen White's life, there's a lot of grief. We'll talk about the loss of 2 of her children. Elizabeth Harmon was Ellen White's twin sister, her fraternal twin. Ellen called her Lizzie. She married a Quaker, last name of Bangs, Reuben Bangs. He was a Portland, Maine grocer, worked in a grocery store. He never, I should say, Elizabeth or Lizzie never accepted Ellen White's gift, never became a Seventh-day Adventist. And Arthur White, who managed the White estate, the grandson of Ellen White, said that his grandmother often, or had told the family, she did not expect to see Lizzie in heaven. Now, why is that? Because Lizzie never accepted the Sabbath, or Lizzie never became a vegetarian? No, it's because Lizzie rejected Jesus. Remember, the family was ousted from their home church in Portland? This was a very difficult experience for the children. Of all the children, Lizzie took it the hardest. And we believe that because of that experience, Lizzie rejected God and never embraced Christianity. Ellen appealed to Lizzie repeatedly to come to Christ. And I will share with you a letter that she wrote to Lizzie when Lizzie was on her deathbed, appealing to Lizzie to come to Christ. But that'll fit better later in my presentation this afternoon. Here is a picture of Ellen with her twin sister Lizzie. Slight difference in the configuration of the face. Ellen White had an accident that changed the look of her face, which we'll discuss in a moment. But that is a picture of her twin sister Lizzie in later years, in 1878. At age 9, Ellen Harmon suffered a tragic accident, which she later wrote was to affect my whole life. If you've grown up hearing about Ellen White, of course you've already heard this story. Perhaps a number of these things I've already shared if you've looked into her personal life. Ellen and one of her sisters were walking home from school. She had an argument with a girl, a childish trifle, and the girl was trailing them, following them. And traditionally, as the story has been told, this happened in the big main park, Central Park. But we found that it actually happened at a little commons, which we would call a little small park. They were taking a shortcut to get to home as fast as they could to get away from this girl. And the girl evidently threw a stone, probably not meaning to hit the girls, just to scare them. But her aim was different than what she thought. And as Ellen turned around to see where the girl was, it hit her right on the face, on the nose, and she went completely unconscious. And when she woke up, she was told that she was covered with blood, and several friends picked her up and helped her walk back home. That was a mistake. Today, you would be carried to a hospital on a stretcher, and your neck and head stabilized with some head injury, and that intensified the trauma, and she went into a coma for several weeks. She didn't even remember what happened. She was told what happened in those early days after the accident. So she was in a coma 3 weeks, continued to lay in a great cradle that was constructed especially for her, many additional weeks. She wrote, "I was reduced almost to a skeleton." Her personal physician and family did not expect her to live. She was what, as they called in the 19th century, a 19th century euphemism, marked for the grave. They did not expect her to live. Convinced that she was dying, the young 9-year-old Ellen gave her heart to Jesus in simple faith. Now, there's been a study done on Ellen White's conversion experience, and there are 3 phases to her conversion experience. The first phase is here on what she thought was her deathbed. She accepted Jesus in simple faith. Several months later, on January 25, 1837, a dramatic aurora borealis lit up the New England sky, this phenomenon that happens in the New England area. And I did some research about this, and this was written about all over the community. In many newspapers, they thought it was so vivid, many people thought it was the end of the world. And young Ellen woke up in the middle of the night and heard the commotion outside, and her mother walked in the room, and she asked her mother to take her to the window. Young Ellen believed this was the second coming of Jesus. She clapped her hands and was very happy because she believed Jesus is coming. But the brilliant light over time faded, and Jesus did not come. She later wrote, "But I was disappointed. The singular appearance faded away from the heavens, and the next morning the sun arose the same as usual." And she was stuck again with her very bad condition. The prospect that she must continue living in the midst of her suffering extinguished Ellen's short-lived childlike joy. Over the next 4 years, she struggled with discouragement and chronic depression. Because of her poor health, she could not return to school and gave up her hope of an education, something she very much desired. In fact, Ellen was really a good student. Years later, she remembered riding on a train. She was, of course, an adult now, and a woman tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Ma'am, is your name Ellen?" She said, "Yes." "Ellen Harmon, I remember you when we were in school together. I remember whenever the teacher wanted somebody to read out loud, she always called on you because you could read the best." So Ellen was a good student. It was very, very disappointing for her that she could not return to school. She would try to read and get dizzy, and she said great beads of sweat would build on her forehead, and it was a frustrating experience, and she very much missed that. "I was unreconciled to my lot," she wrote, "and at times murmured against the providence of God in thus afflicting me." And she was very sensitive spiritually, and so she felt guilty because she murmured against God. Her conscience was unusually sensitive, and she experienced strong feelings of guilt over her resentment. Her simple faith in Jesus disappeared, and she was left in darkness. The feeling was compounded by her belief in an eternally burning hell, which exacerbated her fear and agony of soul. Of course, in the Methodist Church, they grew up believing in eternal burning hell. Reflecting on that experience, she wrote, "In my mind, the justice of God eclipsed His mercy and love. The mental anguish I passed through at this time was very great. I had been taught to believe in an eternally burning hell. And as I thought of the wretched state of the sinner without God, without hope, I was in deep despair. I feared that I should be lost and that I should live throughout eternity a living death. The horrifying thought was ever before me that my sins were too great to be forgiven and that I should be forever lost. When the thought took possession of my mind that God delighted in the torture of His creatures, who were formed in His image, a wall of darkness seemed to separate me from Him. When I reflected that the Creator of the universe would plunge the wicked into hell, there to burn through the ceaseless rounds of eternity, my heart sank with fear. And I despaired that so cruel and tyrannical a being would ever condescend to save me from the doom of sin. I thought that the fate of the condemned sinner would be mine, to endure the flames of hell forever, even as long as God Himself existed. Almost total darkness settled upon me, and there seemed no way out of the shadows." Now, psychologists would say this poor girl was clinically depressed. And it was that way for several years. So we could say that in some of her early teen years, Ellen White was clinically, or young Ellen Harmon at the time, was clinically depressed. So teenagers who experienced discouragement and depression, Ellen could relate to that. She also read devotional books from the church library that described little girls as living saintly lives free from doubts, sins, and weaknesses. That was typical of 19th century literature about children. Children were perfect little beings who never made mistakes. Of course, we know how untrue that is. But a little girl with a sensitive conscience like Ellen, she believed that was how children really were. And she looked at her own life and saw that she was very far from that standard, so that plunged her into even greater discouragement and depression. Fortunately, a breakthrough in her spiritual experience occurred at the Buxton, Maine Methodist camp meeting late in the summer of 1841. This would be the second phase of Ellen White's conversion. Upon hearing a convicting sermon on righteousness by faith, Ellen cried out to God for salvation. She wrote about that later and said, "As I knelt and prayed, suddenly my burden left me, and my heart was light. I can never forget this precious assurance." I bolded those two words, precious assurance of the pity and tenderness of Jesus towards one so unworthy of his notice. She embraced Christ on the cross, and she received personal assurance of salvation. She accepted Jesus as her Savior, and that sense of assurance for the rest of her life never left her. Ellen White believed earnestly that Christians can have assurance of salvation. In fact, I did a study, and I found a number of statements from this statement, the beginning of her Christian experience, all throughout the decades of her prophetic ministry to the very end of her life. She encouraged others to have assurance of salvation, and she expressed her own sense of assurance of salvation. In fact, if you read in my book, Ellen White Under Fire, in one of the chapters, 5 pages is devoted to listing all of those statements in chronological order. Some people say that Ellen White robbed the Christian of assurance because she said, never say, "I am saved." But she's writing to the once saved, always saved issue. The Calvinistic idea that once you're saved no matter what you may do. She was speaking to that issue. But in other contexts, she believed that Christians, although we can choose to leave Christ, but as long as we embrace Jesus, we can have assurance of salvation. And that was precious to her at this early stage of her experience. That's the second phase of her conversion experience. The culmination of Ellen White's conversion experience, the third and final phase, was a counseling session in 1843 initiated by her mother with an Adventist Methodist minister named Levi Stockman. Now, Stockman was a Millerite. Ellen had already attended some of William Miller's meetings and deeply moved at the promise of Jesus' soon return. This meeting with Stockman, followed by a significant prayer meeting experience, later that same day transformed young Ellen's entire Christian experience. Stockman was a man of great spiritual discernment, and by the way, he was dying with tuberculosis, as we'd call it today. Ellen herself was struggling with the same disease. She would be healed from it, and so they both coughed their way through this conversation. And Stockman told Ellen, he said, "I sense in my heart, God has something special for you. Stay faithful to the Lord. He's going to use you in a great way." And that gave young Ellen great encouragement. And she went to a prayer meeting after that. It was one of the old Methodist prayer meetings, not like we would think. The shouting Methodist prayer meetings, okay? She would, of course, move away from that as her Christian experience matured. But at that prayer meeting, that's when she experienced the Methodist view of sanctification. So that was the final phase of her conversion experience, from simple accepting of Jesus to embracing Jesus as her Savior and assurance of salvation, and then embracing the power of sanctification and Christian growth. And that would characterize her writings the rest of her life. Her Methodist background. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. I became an Adventist when I was 17 years old. I came out of the Methodist Church, and I've studied John Wesley over the years, and Ellen White drew a lot from John Wesley. He was her theological, spiritual mentor. The book Steps to Christ is full of John Wesley's ideas. John Wesley was clearly led by the Lord and a biblical theologian, a biblical preacher, and Ellen White wrote out of that tradition. We Adventists, we come out of the Wesleyan tradition. Now let's start moving through Ellen's early life. Here's a picture of Ellen in her early 30s. You can see remnants of the disfiguration on her nose. Of course, they didn't have plastic surgery in that day. In fact, I should back up and say, as a young girl, when she did get to the point where she could go out and play among her friends, her young friends made fun of her face. We have no pictures of how she looked in the years after the accident, but apparently her face was significantly disfigured, and her young friends made fun of her. And years later, she went back to Portland, Maine. She reflected on that experience. She said, the trials that I went through then, God used them to turn my heart to heaven. So here she is at 30 years old. Her face had healed a lot since the accident. This is in the late 1850s. She was married now to James Springer White. The ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace in Portland, Maine on August 30, 1846. It was a simple ceremony. At this time, he was 25 years old and she was 18 years old. They had caught each other's eye in their travels when her sisters were traveling with Ellen, sharing her visions. James was very interested in this. And as he listened to her relate her visions, he believed that they were of God. And so he would travel with them as well. And they caught each other's eye. They began to talk. There was an attraction, mutual attraction to each other. And they fell in love. But they thought, the Lord's coming soon. Maybe we shouldn't get married. But after a while, they realized they could do a greater work for the Lord together. And so they got married on August 30, 1846. And they had 4 children. But before I get into the children, let me tell you just a bit about the marriage. Overall, they had a sound, solid marriage, but it was a normal, average marriage, and they had some struggles, especially years later when James had several strokes. It changed his personality. He became more cantankerous, more paranoid, more negative and critical. And he even began to criticize his wife. And it got to the point where they realized they needed to work apart for a while. In fact, Ellen wrote about that. While I'm thinking about it, maybe I'll just share that with you, what she said. Here's one letter that she wrote. At least I thought I had that here. I thought I had the page marked. Anyway, I'll summarize it. She wrote to James and said, she wrote to a friend. It was her best friend, and she confided in her friend about her struggles with James. She said, James is constantly criticizing me. He has his work back in Battle Creek. I have my work here. That's the way we should do it, and we should just work independently. Because the Lord knows what I should do, and it's not my husband's place to tell me how to do my ministry. So he can work there, and I'm going to work here. And that's what they did for a while. But then, and Ellen actually wrote several letters to her friend Lucinda. And then she became convicted and felt that she shouldn't have shared so much with Lucinda. And she wrote her and said, I'm sorry for what I said. Would you please burn the letters that I wrote to you about James? Well, Lucinda did not burn the letters, and we still have them today, and they've been very insightful in understanding this phase of Ellen and James' experience. They really had some struggles, but here's what's interesting. After Ellen White wrote that letter to Lucinda and said, burn my letters, then she wrote to James and apologized. She said, I'm so sorry for my attitude, and they came back together, and they were one until James died. And so they had struggles in their marriage, but they chose to stay married, and overall they were deeply in love. In fact, Ellen greatly grieved about the loss of James. He died in 1881, and Ellen chose never to marry after that, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. Let's talk about the children. They had 4 children. The youngest son, John Herbert, was born on the eve of the Civil War. Unfortunately, he died from a horrible disease called erysipelas, a skin disease, very painful. And James himself was away when the baby died. He had to come back, and James himself, the father, conducted the funeral. Imagine how difficult that must have been. Their firstborn, Henry, died prematurely at age 16 years of age of pneumonia. They had no cure for that then, no antibiotics for pneumonia. Henry died, Interestingly, in the midst of the Civil War, in December of 1863, he died right after the battles of Chattanooga, which were a major turning point in the Union's effort to defeat the Confederacy. He was outside folding some literature, helping his mother and father, and he caught a chill. And he became very ill. And on his deathbed, he asked his parents to call his friends, and he talked to his friends, and he called his friends to come to the Lord. And then he told his father, Fortunately, I'll never be drafted into the Army. Just then, the draft was kicking in. And he and his brother Edson actually had been enamored with the soldiers marching in Battle Creek as they were preparing to go to war. And they would go and actually march with the soldiers. And then they would come home and they would construct bow and arrows and shoot birds and pretend like they were in battle. Even got some of the Adventist neighbors upset that the white boys were playing these warlike games. And they made drums, and Henry was very musical. He could whistle and sing, and he actually went by the fairgrounds and watched a company of soldiers march, and they had the flute players. The soldiers would march to the flute players, the fifes. And Henry began to whistle. And the commander told the flute players to stop, and the soldiers marched along to the whistling of Henry. And he was so excited by that, he went home and told his mother and father, I want to join the army as a drummer. He actually wanted to go to battle as a drummer boy in the Civil War. But his parents obviously did not want that to happen. They talked him out of it, and they moved the children away from Battle Creek, away from the marching of the soldiers. When Henry died, you can only imagine the heartbreak of parents losing a teenage son. When he died, Ellen White wrote, "Our house is a lonely house. Our sweet singers around no more to sing to us." Henry, unlike his mother, was a gifted singer, and they missed that very much. The two children that survived and grew into adulthood are pictured here. This is taken right after the Civil War in 1865. You have little Willie on the left and James Edson, he was known as Edson, on the right. A bit about these boys. Edson White, James Edson White, but he was known as Edson to differentiate him from his father. There he is as a youth and then as a grown man. Edson, oh Edson. Edson, what shall we say? He was a rebellious teen. He did not obey his parents. Ellen White wrote a friend in 1854 when Henry and Edson were just little boys. And she said, "You have seen Henry. Well, Edson was 5 years old at the time, has more life and roughery than Henry. So you must know that my hands are full." Well, as Edson hit the teen years, Ellen's hands were really full. Edson basically did everything his mother wrote against. At one time, he bought an expensive watch with a chain on it, which would be considered jewelry, and an expensive coat, a whole week's salary. And he paraded up and down in front of the Review and Herald with that expensive dress. His mother said, "Don't read fiction." He read the latest fiction of the day, the dime novels of the 19th century, cheap literature. He read that. One time he was sitting in church next to his mother, and his mother later described it. She said he plops his feet on the pew in front of him, lays his head back, and sleeps through the sermon, sitting right next to his prophet mother. So Edson, caused a lot of heartache and grief to James and Ellen. She wrote numerous letters, numerous epistles to Edson. One of them, she said this. Now, this is in 1865, about the time when the picture was taken, him as a youth. He was 16 years old. She wrote about his disposition to disobedience. And she said, "Edson, you not only disobeyed us yourself, but Willie, who was 5 years younger, to disobedience. A thorn has been planted in my heart from that time, when I became convinced that you could not be trusted. A gloom which I cannot express shrouds our minds in regard to your influence upon Willie. This influence we have seen has affected our noble-hearted, truthful Willie. You see what's happening? Willie's the noble-hearted, truthful Willie, but Edson's the bad boy. You do things and enjoin upon him strict secrecy. And when questioned, he evades it by saying, I don't know. Today, they would say whatever. That's the term my kids use. Whatever. I got sick of whatever. I'd give them a little lecture about something. Whatever. It got to the point when I heard whatever, off came the belt. Tired of that. But in that day was, I don't know. What's he doing? I don't know. I don't know. That's what he said. So, he evades it by saying, I don't know, when he does know. And thus you lead him to lie in order to keep concealed your cherished darling projects. Oh, Edson, it is the knowledge of these things that is wearing me out and bringing upon me discouragement, which will compel me to cease laboring in the cause of God. She was so discouraged over Edson, she considered dropping out of her prophetic ministry. You had so little sense of the true value of character. You seemed as much pleased in the society of Marcus Ashley, that was Edson's bad boy friend, of Marcus Ashley as with your own innocent brother Willie. Speaking of Willie, she said, he is a treasure, beloved of God, but I fear your influence will ruin him. Now, Ellen White had some great things to say to parents in later years. But she'd evidently learned that from trial and error as a parent herself, as well as from visions. Because this contrasting good little Willie, a treasure, with bad boy Edson was not a good idea. That put a thorn in Edson's side the rest of his life. He was jealous and often antagonistic towards his brother. So Ellen herself was not a perfect parent. She was human and made mistakes. This letter shows it. Not everything she wrote was inspired. She'll tell you when something she says is inspired. The Lord has shown me. But when she wrote about common things, the wagon breaking down, the chickens in the pen, and Edson and Willie here, she's writing as a human. She's writing as a real person. Here she's writing as a desperate mother, doing the best that she can. She would learn by trial and error, and she would have wise things to say to parents in later years. Anyway, she went on, she said again regarding Willie, he is a treasure, beloved of God, but I fear your influence will ruin him. My poor Willie, I see no way for us but to cease traveling and to do what we can to save our own children. So Edson grew. He married a girl, dated and married a girl that James and Ella didn't approve of. Ellen White wrote him and said, your father weeps over your case. He grew into manhood. His late 30s, early 40s, he decided he'd had it with not only Adventism, but Christianity. And of course, he wrote a strong letter to his brother Willie, telling him about his decision. And Willie shared that with his mother. You can imagine when she read that, she went into orbit, and she was very concerned and sought the Lord. And the Lord actually gave her a vision about Edson on a sinking ship. And then she wrote another letter, one of her many epistles to Edson. And here she shared what she'd seen in vision, and she appealed to him out of the love that only a mother can share with her son, to come back to the Lord. It's very interesting. Most of Ellen White's letters were typed by her typist, her writings, but some of them were handwritten. Those are the ones she did not want her typist to see. And this was one of those handwritten letters. But at the top of it, this letter, there was scribbled this note at the top. It was blazoned across the top of the letter. It said, Edson, please read this carefully. Do not cast it aside or burn it. Evidently, he had burned some of her previous letters, and she heard about it. Please don't burn this one. And then there was a postscript after the letter. which said she apologized for her scribbling. She said, "I do not want to put it in the hands of a typist." So Edson read this letter, and it touched him in a way that no other letter she'd written did. And he gave his heart to the Lord. He shared it with his brother. He forgave his brother. And it was a real conversion experience for Edson. And his next question was, what can I do for the Lord? And he served the Lord and the church for the rest of his life. He wrote many great religious writings for the church, and he pioneered the work in the South. This was years after the Civil War now, and the South was opening up to work among the black people. And it was Edson who first went down and pioneered the work among the black people. And in the southeastern United States, where I live, as I travel in that area, you can see the results of Edson's work with a significant presence of Black Seventh-day Adventists and the conferences there, and huge Black Seventh-day Adventist churches, a testimony to Edson's work. He wasn't perfect, though. He still had some character issues and still didn't do well with his money. In fact, when his mother died, part of her estate was used to pay off some of Edson's debts. So while the Lord used him, he certainly was not perfect. William White, when James died, Ellen was shown in vision that it would be Willie who would help her with her writings. And that's what Willie did the rest of her life. He managed her large writing staff at the end of her life. We know a lot about Ellen White's writings and insights into her life and her thought and her theology because of the work and ministry of Willie. There he is as a boy, and then him as an older man. When Willie was a little boy, he was attending school in Battle Creek. He did not like his teacher. And one day, when school was out, he crawled in an open window and scribbled a poem he had made up about his teacher on the board. The next morning, the class filed into the room, and the teacher walked in, and they all read these words on the chalkboard. The devil flew east, west, north, and south, and picked Miss Jones up in his mouth. But when he saw he had a fool, he dropped her here to teach the school. Willie White. Of course, it was discovered that he is the one who wrote that, and he was punished for it. Obviously, as an older man, he worked with his mother. They would go and speak a lot together. He was often on the platform behind her as she spoke. He was one of these people that could fall asleep real easy. Go to sleep any place, anywhere. Those of you that struggle with insomnia, don't you envy a person like that who can go to sleep anywhere, any place? In fact, she nicknamed him Sleeping Willie. And one day she was up delivering a solemn message to an audience. Willie was behind her, and as she was speaking, she noticed that there were smiles on the audience's faces, and some of them were snickering, and they were trying to hold back their laughing. And she paused, and she knew what was happening. She listened, and Willie was gone. And so she turned around, and all the smiles disappeared when she looked back at the audience, and she told him, "Now, the reason he's sleeping, it's my fault. You see, when Willie was a little baby, and I'd go and preach in the Battle Creek Tabernacle, in the huge pulpit, the brethren constructed a little rocker that fit in the bottom of the pulpit, and I would put little baby Willie there. And with my right foot, I would rock him while I preached, so he wouldn't wake up during the sermon and disturb the audience. Well, now, as you can see today, he's not gotten over the habit of sleeping through my sermons." And of course, the audience appreciated that. They had a good laugh. And that's interesting because Ellen used humor in the pulpit. Now, when I pastored for 10 years in Gulf States Conference, then I went to Chicago, and I was a youth pastor for a while before I came to Southern to teach. And I used humor in my sermons to the young people. And one day, a well-intentioned but misguided church member, who I never know who that was to this day because they didn't come to me eyeball to eyeball, toe to toe. They dropped on my porch a stack of Ellen White quotes on cards, 3x5 cards. And it was all about her statements speaking against humor in the pulpit. But if you read those statements in their historical context, in the 19th century, Methodist ministers would get up, many denominations would get up, and they would just tell jokes not related to the message. And Adventist preachers started doing that. And Ellen White felt that that was distracting from the message. And that's the context in which she discouraged Adventist ministers from using humor in the pulpit. But appropriate humor, she was not against that. So I never apologize for using humor with young people. And there's a place for it. It can be overdone, but there's certainly a proper place for it. And Ellen White had no problem with it. And in a minute, I'm going to share with you about Ellen White's own humor. Believe it or not, the lady laughed. Okay, more on that in a moment. Here she is in her late 30s. Let's see, that clock is right. I've got to be done here in 10 minutes. Oh, boy. Yikes. Here she is in her late 30s, or mid to late 60s. Here she is at 48 years old in 1875. We're walking through her life. We have to skip over a lot. This is a picture she was fond of sharing. She was writing the Spirit of Prophecy series. That's the second version of the Great Controversy vision she had in 1858. It culminated in the Conflict of the Age series that we have today. Here she is with her twin sister, Elizabeth. I told you I would share some excerpts from a letter she wrote to Lizzie on her deathbed. Lizzie was dying. She had never accepted Christ. Ellen White wrote to Lizzie, and she said, Lizzie, if you'll just become a vegetarian, you'll be saved. Lizzie, if you'll just pay your tithe to the Seventh-day Adventist, you'll be saved. Is that what she said? No. Here is what she said. She's writing to her sister on her deathbed. Don't you believe on Jesus, Lizzie? Do you not believe He is your Savior? He has evidenced His love for you in giving His own precious life that you might be saved. All that is required of you is to take Jesus as your own precious Savior. Isn't that interesting? Ellen White was a great evangelist. She led many to Christ, and she's appealing to her sister here. She went on to say, will you give yourself in trusting faith to Jesus? I long to take you in my arms and lay you on the bosom of Jesus Christ. With Jesus as your blessed friend, you need not fear to die, for it will be to you like the closing of your eyes here and opening them in heaven. Lizzie, my heart longs to see you trusting Jesus, for He can give you His grace to bear all your acute sufferings. He loves you. He wants to save you. But as far as Ellen knew, Lizzie never accepted Jesus. That's why she told her family she did not expect to see Lizzie in heaven. Not because Lizzie didn't become a Seventh-day Adventist, but because Lizzie never accepted Jesus. Here is Ellen White in her mid-50s, 53, approximately. In 1881, at age 60, her husband, James, died. She became a widow. After that, she chose never to remarry. She felt the Lord had called her full-time to this ministry. She did have one proposal. Stephen Haskell asked her to marry him. He was a great worker in the church. They were in Australia together, and he asked her to marry him, and she gently turned him down and said that she felt the Lord had called her to be single. She also felt that she also told him the Lord had shown her that she should sign her name Ellen G. White. Imagine, how does this sound? Ellen G. Haskell. Ellen G. White. And so she knew the Lord had not called her to get married again, although she had no problem with marriage. In fact, she told Brother Haskell, she says, now you do need a wife, brother, and I will help you find a good wife. And she did. So that was a gracious turn down, don't you think? That's how to say no. Here she is at the Reno, Nevada camp meeting in May 1888. You can see her right in the middle, holding her Bible. This, of course, is the year of the famed 1888 Minneapolis General Conference that would occur. This picture is in the early summer, May, and it was in the fall of 1888, the famous Minneapolis General Conference, where the subject of righteousness by faith was debated. Lots of attention given to that subject by Adventist students and historians over the years. We're, of course, not addressing that subject, but it's certainly a very interesting one. She lived and worked in Australia from 1891 to 1900. She arranged for this home to be built in Cornbong, close to what was to become Avondale College. This decade, she actually did not want to go to Australia. This was after the 1888 meetings where she had some run-in with the brethren. They were not happy with her, and they really wanted to get her out of the country. She did not want to go to Australia, but she decided she would submit to the brethren as the voice of the Lord. And when she first got to Australia, she got very sick. She was not happy there, but as the years went by, she realized that that's where she should be in Australia. The decade in Australia were some of her most productive years writing. Her great, what are called Ellen White's great books were written during that time. In the early years she was there, Steps to Christ was published. All of her works on the life of Christ. In the later years she was there, Desire of Ages, Thoughts from a Mount of Blessing, and Christ Object Lessons. Those great books uplifting Christ were written during her journey in Australia. Also, that's when she hammered out her educational philosophy, which has become the educational philosophy of the church today, continues to guide our educational institutions to this day. All written, hammered out during her journey in Australia. Whoops, I'm jumping ahead here. Here is her pet dog in Australia. Ellen White loved animals. She was an animal rights activist. People were cruel to animals in the 19th century, and she wrote against that. And she had pets as a child, and this was her watchdog. She named him Tiglath-Pileser, after the evil Assyrian king. You can see a bit of humor in that. And people ask me, why is the doghouse crooked? Okay? I mean, the poor dog, do you have to sleep that way every night, leaning like this to one side? Well, that's because in the springtime in Australia, or it's the summertime anyway, the rains come and it floods. With the doghouse like this, it was able to drain easy. So Tiglath could crawl into his doghouse at night and not drown in the water. It would drain regularly when the rains came. They didn't have to worry about it. Now, this is where I want to share with you some humorous anecdotes about Ellen White and her experience. She was not against humor at all. In fact, in Testimonies, Volume 1, of all places, would you believe there's some humor? I often tell pastors, it's probably not a good idea to have new converts start with the testimonies. Start them off with Steps to Christ and some of the lighter books. Testimonies is heavyweight. It's good stuff there, but you want to get some experience and then get into the testimonies. But we often think of the testimonies as hardcore stuff, but there's actually a bit of humor there. Testimonies, Volume 1. She's talking about dress, women who did not really understand Reformed dress and how to do it right. She said, there are sisters that went about their work. They should not put on clothing which would make them look like images to frighten the crows from the corn. There's a little bit of humor in the language that she said, used there. And she was telling some of her granddaughters not to dress as if they're going to a funeral every day, or when the clothing of some tasteless individuals looks as if it flew and lit upon their persons. And one time she was a bit irritated with James, and she wrote to one of her sons, and she said, your father's being a cabbage head. A cabbage head. A cabbage head. So she could even be a little sarcastic at times. And Doris E. Robinson, who worked among Ellen White's editorial staff in later years, when he first came to work with her as a young man, he wrote about his experience. He said, I was 20 years old and very bashful and wondered how I could live and hold converse with such a saintly woman whose conversation I expected to be entirely upon sacred things. Mrs. McInturfer, that was Ellen White's companion and nurse at the time, brought in a dish of greens. Now, keep in mind, on the table there was a dish of peas, all right? And Mrs. McInturfer brings in a dish of greens, probably spinach, kale, something like that. which Mrs. White requested at nearly every meal because she thought they were good for elderly people. Mrs. McIntosh set the personal dish before Sister White with the joking remark, "Here is your horse feed, Mother." And then Robinson writes, "I was horrified and was looking to see Sister White rebuke her for this levity. But Sister White glanced quickly over the table, and with a humorous glint in her eye and her mouth curved up slightly, she remarked, "I don't know that my horse food is any worse than your cow peas." So, just a little bit of humor she used there. My favorite story, and there's much more humor I could share with you, but I'm running out of time. But this is my favorite story. This is when she was coming back from Australia to the United States. They went on a larger ship, and they stopped by the island of Samoa. And an Adventist community had emerged on this island. Ellen wanted to go visit and encourage them. And so she and her daughter-in-law, May, with May's infant child, they got off the boat into a smaller boat and went up to the shore. Some of the huge, hefty men of Samoa, it was a tropical area, so they weren't wearing shirts, they were hot and sweaty. They came up to help the women off the little boat. And it was rocking back and forth on the beach and the waves. And the two of the big men, they put their arms into the form of locked their hands together into the shape of a chair and motioned for Ellen White to get on. And so Ellen sat in their arms, and they brought her on the shore and put her on a rock. And she's facing the beach watching the boat. And so they go out to get May, her daughter-in-law, and the little baby. And one of them takes an umbrella and motions for May to give him the baby. He takes the baby in his arm, and he walks back on the beach. And the other fellow, huge man, he went up to May, he turned his sweaty back to her, and he motioned for her to get on. Now, Ellen's on the rock watching all of this, okay? May would write about this years later and tell us the story. And so she reluctantly put her arms around his sweaty body and held on, and she had a long dress, and he began to walk, and she's bouncing back and forth, and she began to slip and hold on, and the waves are splashing behind, and you can imagine how that looked from shore. She's slipping and falling all over, trying to hang on for dear life. Well, that struck Ellen as funny. And so May wrote years later, she says, Mother, she called her Mother, she says, and Mother began to laugh and laugh and laugh. She laughed so hard, she fell off the rock. And when the men quickly ran up to pick her up, her head was on the back, back was on the sand, she was still laughing. And when I tell this story to students in my classes, the young people, I tell them, embed that picture of Ellen White laughing uncontrollably into your mind. She was a real person. She was just like us. She found things funny as well as things sad. She was a real person. Maybe you should keep that in your mind as well. Ellen White laughing so hard she falls off a rock. That's a side of Ellen White we need not forget. Here she is with her family at Elmshaven, a happy grandmother, as you can see, with family surrounding her as she aged. Here is a picture at the dedication of Loma Linda Sanitarium. This is one of the only two pictures we have of Ellen White speaking to an audience. The other one is when she spoke at the 1901 General Conference, and several stories I could tell here, but I don't think I have time. But let's just say that she was a very good speaker. I will tell this, one leader. Now, they didn't have microphones in that day, but Ellen White could speak to an audience, one camp meeting, audience up to 20,000 people with no microphone. She knew how to project her voice. She taught preachers to project their voice. I teach preaching at Southern. That's one of my areas. As your pastor said, I'm a homiletician. I teach preachers how to preach, and I always deal with the voice, and I always refer to Ellen White as an example. She taught preachers to speak from the diaphragm, not from the throat, but from the diaphragm. And she learned that herself. And she could project her voice. And one leader, church leader, he was in a big tent, and he could hear Ellen White very clearly at the front of the tent. He went to the back where, like at any normal camp meeting, you have all these little committees of people talking, right? And visiting. And he could hear her voice just as clear then. He went outside the tent. He could still hear her voice booming out of the front of the tent. He went yards and yards away from the tent. He could still hear her voice flowing out of the tent as if he were right inside listening to her. The woman could not only preach, she could project her voice without a microphone. So what a thrill it would have been. How I would have loved to have been in our audience to hear Ellen White preach. Oh, if we only had a recording of Ellen White. We actually have some video of Willie White, her son, playing with his grandchildren. Wouldn't it be neat to have that of Ellen White? We don't. Just testimonies of people who knew her. As she aged, she was not able to get out and walk. In fact, when she was younger, she was bucked off a horse and broke her ankle. And there wasn't a physician to set her ankle, so she never was able to really walk well after that. So she could not get out and walk for exercise. And so she put on some weight as she got older. Although she still was healthy, she just was not able to exercise, but she loved to be outside in fresh air. Here she is with Sarah McInturfer out riding. And one day they were in the Washington, D.C. area, riding in a carriage, and they saw a big caravan come by, and it was the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. And as he rode by, he nodded to the two ladies, tipped his hat. Ellen White later wrote about that, how exciting it was to see the President of the United States in person, a few yards away. This woman had seen angels in vision, and she was still excited to see the President of the United States. Here she is at the 1901 General Conference. How long do I have?
All evening.
All evening? Isn't there a meeting at 3:45, Mary Ellen? Is there a meeting at 3:45? Okay. But can I get away with going maybe 5-6 more minutes? Okay. I just want to tell one story here before I get to the latter part. At the 1901 General Conference, this is probably my favorite story. It's the favorite story of many Ellen White specialists who talk about Ellen White, people at the White Estate, because it involves the Bible. This was her last General Conference she ever spoke at. She came all the way from California across the United States speaking in her 80s, okay? Speaking and preaching, and she was on the docket for this General Conference. She spoke all week long, and it was the last meeting of the General Conference, and she was speaking. She spoke on being partakers of the divine nature, and the audience and the brethren knew she was up in years. This would probably be the last time they would ever hear her preach at a General Conference, and they were right. She would die 6 years later. She never attended another General Conference after this. So since this was her last sermon to the church gathered in session. And so she ended her message. It was a moving message and many tears in the audience. She turned to take her seat very slowly, and she stopped and paused and turned around. She had laid her Bible on the pulpit. She walked back up, and every eye is riveted upon her, expecting to hear maybe more of a sermon. She picked up her Bible. This woman who had hundreds and hundreds of visions over the years, had written many wonderful books. She took that Bible, and with arms trembling with age, she held it out before that vast audience. And she said, "Brethren, I commend to you this book." And she placed the Bible back in the pulpit and took her seat. Those were her last official words to a General Conference in session. She could have held up Desire of Ages or her book Great Controversy, but no, she held the Bible up. And that was more than just a kind gesture to the Bible. That was an expression of her lifelong passion to exalt the Scriptures before her people. Ellen White exalted the Bible repeatedly throughout her prophetic ministry. And that story, that event perfectly illustrated her lifelong passion with the Bible. As you know, many of you know, toward the end of her life, in early 1915, she tripped and fell on her way to her study in the Elmshaven home. She was bedridden 6 months after that. This picture was taken while she was bedridden up there with Sarah McInturfer, her nurse and helper, at the Elmshaven home. Then she died in July of 1915. Here are some pictures from the funeral. Large gathering of Adventists. This was a turning point, a major turning point in Adventism. The question in everyone's mind is, how are we going to do this without her? She was the longest living Millerite. All the other Millerites had died, those who had followed William Miller. And she had been there from the very beginning. and had guided the church through its formative years, and now she was no more. Fortunately, the legacy of her writings continue to guide the church today. But there was a lot of Adventist attendance, as you can see. And here is the burial plot. Looks a bit different today. There's a wall behind it that wasn't there then. Here is a Bible in the shape of flowers with Revelation 22:12 inscribed upon it. Behold, I come quickly. My reward is with me. Certainly appropriate for Ellen White's graveside next to her husband. I want to end with this beautiful memory from Ella Mae Robinson, the granddaughter of Ellen White. My friend Jim Nix, the director of the White Estate, interviewed her years ago on October 12, 1979. Elder Nix did that a lot and interviewed people. And those interviews, by the way, will be put on the website very soon if they're not already, the Ellen G. White Estate website. But Ella Mae Robinson remembered as a young girl, she was relating to Elder Nix, her memory as a young girl hearing her grandmother preach. And one particular sermon, an event transpired she never forgot. And she described it to Elder Nix in first person. I see Grandma, she told Elder Nix, standing in the pulpit, dressed in her loose-fitting black sack suit, narrow cuffs of white, narrow white collar, secure at the throat by a small brooch. She's been telling of the matchless love of Christ in suffering, ignominy, and death, and even running the risk of eternal separation from his Father in heaven by taking upon himself the sins of the world. She pauses, looks up, and with one hand resting on the desk and the other lifted heavenward, she exclaims in a ringing voice, "Oh, Jesus, how I love you, how I love you, how I love you." There is a deep hush. Heaven is very near. That is the real Ellen White. She loved Jesus and she loved Scripture. That's the best way to describe Ellen White. Her life for Jesus and for Scripture. That is Ellen White. Let's pray. Gracious God, thank you for this prophetic gift that has been manifested in our midst. Thank you for the person of Ellen White. She was a real person just like the rest of us. Help us to understand this side of her life better, as well as her prophetic ministry, and give us each deeper appreciation and love for these writings, that we might partake of them ourselves. So bless each to this end, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. I know that the pastor wanted me to have a Q&A, and I'm glad to do that, but I think I better end it